Every town has a night that refuses to be forgotten. For Fairhope, Indiana, it was Halloween night in 1997. The wind had that unmistakable October chill, the kind that turned breath to mist and carried the smell of burning leaves through the neighborhood. Streetlights flickered as if hesitating between duty and fright. Jack-o'-lanterns flickered on porch steps, and costumed children rushed from door to door with plastic buckets swinging in their hands. That year, the Mercer children were among them. Lucas, age 12, wore a homemade Dracula costume, his white shirt crisp and his cape billowing dramatically. Emily, age 9, had dressed as a fairy with glitter on her cheeks and a purple wand clutched tightly in one hand. Jamie, age 7, wore a pumpkin suit 2 sizes too big. Their mother, Diane Mercer, took a photo before they left. That photo would be printed in newspapers across the state within days. Diane had let them go alone that year, just like every other year. Fairhope was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone. It was the kind of place where the corner bakery still hand-wrote receipts and kids rode bikes until sunset. The Mercer children had strict boundaries. They were to stick together and follow the loop around Chestnut, Brimley, and Maple, then come straight home. Diane stayed by the door with a bowl of candy in one hand and a cordless phone in the other. She remembered pacing by the window at 8:45 p.m., glancing down the street where costumed kids were thinning out. By 9:15, the street was empty. By 9:30, Diane had stepped off the porch, her heart thudding louder than the leaves rustling around her ankles. She called out their names. At first, it was casual, almost playful. She walked 2 houses down, then 5, then 10. Neighbors stepped outside, confused but kind, and offered to help. They formed a line and combed the neighborhood, calling for Lucas, Emily, and Jamie. Someone knocked on every door. Another neighbor called the police. It was only 10 p.m. when the first squad car pulled up, siren off, headlights dimmed. Officer Delaney, the town's youngest cop, stepped out and asked for a description. Diane's voice cracked as she listed off costumes instead of clothing. Dracula, fairy, pumpkin. She handed him the photo. He looked at it for a moment too long. The search expanded through the night. Flashlights bobbed through the woods behind the school. Helicopters were requested from the next county. They circled low with spotlights that lit the treetops like daylight. There were no screams, no signs of a struggle, just silence. The children had seemingly vanished. No one could find a single footprint past the Brimley Lane fork. No candy bags, no scraps of costume fabric, not even Jamie's pumpkin hat, which Diane said he had insisted on wearing backward. The red farmhouse at the end of Brimley Lane stood still and empty. It had been abandoned since 1986. Everyone in town knew it. No one ever went near it. But that was the last place 3 kids were seen by anyone. One of the local boys, Tommy Rudd, claimed he had seen them on Brimley. He said they were laughing and talking to someone dressed as a scarecrow. He pointed to the corner near the red farmhouse where they stopped. The scarecrow was leaning against the fence holding a wooden rake. It wasn't unusual for people to dress up and decorate. But when authorities asked who had dressed as the scarecrow that night, no one came forward. Not a single photo from that Halloween showed such a costume. No adult or teen admitted to being in the area. Diane remembered the moment she heard that detail. She went quiet. Then she walked into her house, closed the door, and didn't come out for hours. The town changed after that night. Parents kept their children close. Trick-or-treating was canceled the following year. Porch lights stayed off. The Mercer house, once full of laughter and chalk drawings on the driveway, grew quiet. Diane stopped answering her phone. Her husband, Stephen, had already left years earlier. She was alone with the memories and the empty bedrooms. Reporters came. They asked cruel questions, always looking for blame. But there was nothing to give them. No ransom call, no threats. Just a photo and a story. A mother, 3 kids, and one night that turned into 20 years of silence. By the time 1998 rolled around, the case had gone cold. Officer Delaney was promoted and then transferred. The red farmhouse caught fire one winter. Kids said it was cursed. The official cause was listed as electrical, but there was no power to the house. Diane never left Fairhope. Every Halloween, she sat on the porch with 3 full candy bags resting beside her and the porch light glowing until dawn. Neighbors whispered, but no one ever said it out loud. No one dared to ask her what she hoped for every October 31st. There were theories. One local claimed the kids had run away. Another believed it was a kidnapping by someone passing through, but nothing stuck. Nothing ever added up. If it had been a kidnapping, why no evidence? Why no sightings? How could 3 children disappear so completely on a night when the streets were full of people, costumes, and noise? Diane clung to the idea that one of them might return, that Lucas, smart and responsible, would have protected the others, that Emily, brave and curious, might have found a way to send a message, that Jamie, sweet and clumsy, might have remembered the way home. What remained was a single Polaroid. Lucas in his Dracula cape, Emily with her glitter wand, Jamie holding his pumpkin belly with both hands giggling. Diane kept it framed in the living room. She dusted it weekly. The image never faded, even when everything else around her did. The world moved on. Fairhope healed. But every time a leaf blew across the sidewalk, every time a child knocked on a door in costume, every time a porch light flicked on, it was as if time had stopped again. The photo, the laughter, the absence. 20 years passed like a stubborn wind. Then, on a mild October morning in 2017, a renovation crew 2 blocks away from the Mercer home tore open an attic wall in an old house. Behind a false panel, they found something that shouldn't have been there. A crumpled paper bag. It was soft with age, its edges torn, its corners stained. Written on it in red marker was one word: Emily. Inside the bag were 3 candies partially melted, the wrappers faded but unmistakable. And a photo that would change everything. The discovery of the candy bag shook Fairhope out of its long slumber. The house where it was found had been vacant for over 15 years and had recently been purchased by a couple moving in from Indianapolis. They had hired a local crew to renovate the attic, planning to turn it into a small reading nook. No one expected to find anything unusual. But as the crew removed insulation and old drywall, one worker noticed a gap behind the beams. When he reached in, his hand brushed against something paper-soft. It was a small crumpled bag, the kind kids used for trick-or-treating before plastic buckets became popular. The name Emily was written in a child's handwriting, with the I dotted by a heart. The crew leader called the police immediately. Within hours, yellow tape surrounded the property. Diane Mercer was notified by a neighbor who had seen the patrol cars. She drove to the scene without speaking, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. Detective Erin Graves, newly transferred from Indianapolis herself, was assigned to the case. She stood in the attic, the afternoon light filtering through slanted windows, and examined the contents of the bag with gloved hands. Inside were 3 pieces of candy. They were warped and faded, their brands barely legible. The wrappers were torn but clearly vintage. Tucked between them was a Polaroid, with edges curling from time and humidity. It showed the 3 Mercer children, their costumes unmistakable, but there was something strange in their expressions. Their smiles were tight, uncertain. Behind them stood floral wallpaper that no one recognized. Graves studied their eyes. They looked off camera, not at the photographer, as though watching someone else in the room. She ordered the photo sent to a lab for digital enhancement, hoping to draw out details in the background. Back at the police station, Diane sat across from Graves in a quiet interview room. She clutched the candy bag, now sealed in a plastic evidence sleeve, her fingers trembling as she traced the faint outline of Emily's name. Graves asked her about the handwriting, the candy brands, and whether the kids had carried that bag on Halloween. Diane nodded slowly. Emily had begged to use that specific bag instead of the pumpkin bucket everyone else had. She had drawn the heart herself. Diane had said no, at first worried it would tear, but Emily had pleaded. She remembered giving in just before the kids left. That moment stuck in her mind like a thorn. Graves then asked a question no one had asked in 2 decades. She wanted to know the exact order of houses the kids were supposed to visit that night. Diane's voice cracked as she listed them: Maple, Chestnut, Brimley, and the last house was supposed to be the corner lot just before the red farmhouse. Graves reviewed old witness statements and found the name of a neighbor who had lived near Brimley in 1997. It was Mrs. Cora Dempsey, now residing in a care facility in the next county. She had reported seeing a scarecrow costume in a group of kids that night. Graves visited her. Cora's memory had softened with age, but she clearly remembered the children. She described Lucas's cape, Emily's glitter, and Jamie's oversized pumpkin suit. She also recalled the scarecrow. She said the figure did not move, but that it was not there earlier that day. It had appeared suddenly around dusk, leaning against the fence at the corner of Brimley Lane. Graves asked for more detail. Cora hesitated, then added that she remembered one strange thing. The scarecrow had been holding a wooden rake with a red ribbon tied to the handle. Graves requested access to the archived police files. In a dusty evidence box, she found a neighborhood sketch made by an officer that night. On it, the red farmhouse was marked along with the nearby homes. One box was labeled Tilley Property. She recognized the name. Ned Tilley had once owned the Brimley farmhouse. He was declared legally dead in 1995 after disappearing in the woods behind his house. No body was ever recovered. Graves pulled his file and learned that Ned had lived alone, was reclusive, and had mental health evaluations on record. He was known for building strange scarecrows and leaving them around the property as a deterrent to trespassers. What disturbed her most was a photo from 1993 showing Ned holding a wooden rake. Tied to the handle was a red ribbon. Diane never mentioned Ned Tilley before. When asked, she admitted she barely knew him. He had lived down the lane but kept to himself. Her children had been warned to avoid the old house. Graves visited the property now, an empty lot with waist-high grass and broken stone steps. She brought a metal detector and found rusted nails, charred wood fragments, and buried glass, likely remnants from the 1999 fire. She crouched by the stone steps and noticed something beneath the soil. It was a small rusted hinge attached to a rotted wooden slab. Further digging revealed a trapdoor long since collapsed in. It led to what was once a root cellar. Graves ordered the site secured. A forensic team would begin excavation the next day. That evening, Graves returned to the attic where the candy bag was found. She reviewed the crime scene photos again. Something kept bothering her. The way the bag was folded, the specific items left inside the placement of the Polaroid. It felt intentional. Not like something forgotten or hidden accidentally. She returned to the homeowner and asked about the attic's history. They said the space had been untouched since they bought the house. Before that, it had been rented by an older man who lived there from 1998 to 2005. The name on the lease was Walter Brimley. The surname caught her attention. Brimley Lane had likely been named after that family. She looked up public records and traced Walter Brimley's relationship to Ned Tilley. They had been cousins. Graves returned to Diane's house after dark. The porch light was on even though Halloween was weeks away. Diane sat on the front steps, the plastic candy bowl beside her empty. Graves sat beside her in silence for a while before showing her the photo again. This time, she pointed to the wallpaper. Diane stared at it longer than before. Then she stood up and walked inside. Graves followed her down the hallway and into a small guest room that Diane had used for storage. She pushed open the closet door. Inside, peeling and faded, was the same floral wallpaper from the Polaroid. Graves felt a chill settle in her spine. The kids had been inside this very house at some point on Halloween night. The next morning, Detective Graves arrived at the Mercer house earlier than expected. The discovery of the matching wallpaper had cast a shadow of suspicion, but it also deepened the mystery. She had spent most of the night reviewing timelines, interview transcripts, and police photos from 1997. Nothing in the records indicated the children had ever re-entered the Mercer home that night. Still, the photo placed them in a room that should have been locked and untouched. Graves knew she needed to tread carefully. Diane had been through more than most people could survive, but the truth had grown roots somewhere in this town, and now pieces of it were starting to break through the surface. Diane opened the door with the same quiet weariness she carried every day. Her eyes were puffy, her shoulders slightly stooped as if weighed down by something heavier than time. Graves stepped into the entryway and asked to look around the guest room again. Diane nodded. Together, they stood inside the small space, silent, as Graves ran her fingers along the peeling wallpaper. She asked when the room was last used. Diane said it had been empty since 1995 after her sister passed away and left a few boxes behind. No one had entered the closet in years. Graves asked if anyone else had access to the house. Diane hesitated before mentioning her brother Charles, who had stayed with her for several months in 1997. The mention of Charles shifted the tone. Graves asked for more details. Diane explained that Charles had struggled after a divorce and needed a place to stay. He had arrived in late September and left shortly after Halloween. Diane remembered he was restless, often leaving the house late at night, always insisting on privacy. He stayed in the basement room, and she rarely asked questions. Graves requested his current address. Diane did not know. They had not spoken in years. She said he moved frequently, never staying in one state for long. Graves returned to her car and made calls to track down his last known address. It led her to a town 3 hours south where a Charles Hendley had registered a P.O. box, but never claimed mail. That was 5 years ago. Graves requested assistance from local police in that county and sent a copy of the Polaroid. In the meantime, she drove back to the Brimley lot where the excavation team had begun digging around the collapsed cellar. The ground was difficult, packed with debris and tangled roots. She stood beside the lead technician who explained they had found remnants of shelving and rotted wood. No bodies, no bones. But there was something else. A lunchbox. It was metal-dented and rusted but still intact. It had a faded sticker of a cartoon dragon popular in the mid-90s. Inside were 2 wrapped candies and a folded napkin. The candies matched those in Emily's bag. The napkin had a name written on it in childish handwriting. It said Jamie. Graves stared at the lunchbox for a long time. She asked if anything else had been found. The technician shook his head. It was too early to say, but the site was yielding more than anyone had expected. She drove straight to the lab where technicians began comparing the writing on the napkin to school records. Early results showed a high likelihood that the handwriting belonged to Diane Mercer. Graves returned to her office and spread out every piece of evidence she had collected. The candy bag, the photo, the napkin. She pinned them to a large board, drawing lines between them. Each connection seemed to circle back to the same conclusion. The children had been taken somewhere familiar. Somewhere they would not resist, and someone they trusted had orchestrated it. As Graves sat reviewing the evidence, a package arrived at the station. It was addressed to her, but the return address was unmarked. Inside was an envelope with a single photograph. It was another Polaroid, this one more faded and taken from a lower angle. It showed Lucas sitting on a wooden floor, his Dracula cape draped around his legs, his eyes staring blankly at the camera. The background was too dark to identify, but the lighting suggested a basement or storage room. Graves immediately had the photo tested for fingerprints. The lab called within 2 hours. A partial print was found on the back of the photo. It matched Charles Hendley. That night, Graves returned to Diane's house. She sat across from her in the dim kitchen and laid the photo on the table. Diane looked at it, her expression blank, at first then slowly unraveled into something closer to horror. She brought her hand to her mouth and stared at the image without speaking. Graves asked her if Charles had ever shown unusual interest in the children. Diane shook her head, then paused. She said there had been a moment just once when Emily had refused to go into the basement while Charles was staying there. She had cried and begged not to go down to get laundry. Diane had dismissed it, thinking Emily had just been scared of spiders or the dark. She never asked again. Graves left the house with a knot in her chest. The pieces were falling into place, but they were grim. She requested a warrant for Charles Hendley's arrest and circulated his photo through neighboring counties. While waiting, she revisited a list of properties once owned by the Tilley family. She found one in a neighboring state, a cabin listed under a shell company, dissolved in 1998. The address was remote off a logging road near a river. Graves and a deputy made the drive, winding through narrow paths flanked by pine trees. The cabin was nearly invisible, covered in vines and moss. They approached cautiously, weapons drawn, and entered through a broken door. Inside the cabin smelled of mildew and dust. The living room was filled with discarded magazines, broken furniture, and empty food cans. In the back room, Graves found a closet with a locked trunk. She forced it open. Inside were dozens of Polaroids. Some were damaged, others still intact. Most showed children in costumes seated or standing in various rooms. A few appeared to show the Mercer children. Graves took photos of everything and sealed the trunk for evidence. Outside, she found a half-buried crate behind the cabin. Inside were old Halloween decorations and more candy wrappers. It was as if someone had been reliving the same night for years. Back at the station, Graves filed a formal report outlining the evidence implicating Charles Hendley. The timeline now suggested he had lured the children home under false pretenses. He had possibly locked them in the basement, staged photos, and later moved them to another location when the search began. The motive remained unclear, but the pattern was disturbing. Graves forwarded the evidence to federal investigators. She sat back in her chair and stared at the caseboard. The truth was emerging slowly, painfully, but it was emerging. The Mercer children had not vanished into thin air. They had been led into the shadows by someone who knew them. Someone who used the comfort of routine and the illusion of safety as a trap. The Mercer case had turned from an old missing persons report into a layered investigation involving multiple states and decades of buried secrets. Detective Graves continued pulling at loose threads that had once been overlooked. She reviewed every early statement again, searching for names that might have been dismissed too quickly. One name that caught her attention appeared in an interview from 1997. It was Raymond Halperin, a retired middle school teacher who had lived on Chestnut Street just 2 blocks from the Mercer home. He had told police at the time that he did not see the children that night, but he mentioned remembering Lucas from school. There was nothing remarkable about the comment at first glance, but when Graves looked further, she realized that Halperin had left Fairhope abruptly in 1998. Graves tracked him to a senior living community outside of Tucson, Arizona. She contacted the local police department to request assistance. Within days, she had a video call scheduled with Raymond Halperin. The man who appeared on screen was gaunt, pale, and breathing through a nasal cannula. He looked weary but alert. Graves introduced herself and explained the reason for the call. At first, Halperin repeated the same thing he had said years ago. He claimed he had nothing to offer. But then he paused, rubbed his forehead, and admitted he might have seen something after all. He said it had haunted him for years, but he was never sure if it had meant anything at all. Halperin described a morning in late October 1997, a few days before Halloween. He had walked to the post office early like he did most days, and passed the Mercer children on their way to school. He said Lucas had slowed down as they neared the corner of Brimley and Maple. Standing near the hedge was a man Halperin did not recognize. He wore a long coat and stood very still watching the children pass. Lucas appeared hesitant but did not say anything. Emily clung to her older brother's arm. Jamie skipped ahead. Halperin remembered the man's shoes. They were heavy work boots, scuffed and dirt-stained. Halperin thought it was strange but not dangerous at the time. Now he wished he had done more than just keep walking. Graves asked him to describe the man in detail. Halperin said he was tall, lean, with a square jaw and thinning hair. He also mentioned a slight limp on the left side. The detail struck Graves. She remembered from Charles Hendley's records that he had once injured his leg in a construction accident, leaving him with a permanent limp. Graves thanked Halperin for his honesty. As the call ended, he looked into the camera and asked one final question. He wanted to know if the children had ever been found. Graves paused, then told him they were still working to bring them home. He nodded slowly, then said he was sorry. His voice broke just before the screen went black. With the new description aligning with Hendley's injuries, Graves grew more certain he had been stalking the children in the days before Halloween. The photo found in the attic, the candy, the basement wallpaper, and now a sighting confirmed by someone with no motivation to lie. She updated her report and expanded the investigation to include locations Hendley had worked at in 1997. One of those places was a storage facility on the outskirts of Fairhope. Records showed he had rented a unit from September through November of that year. It had never been searched. Graves obtained a warrant and drove to the facility with 2 uniformed officers. The manager confirmed the unit had been abandoned and cleared out years ago but allowed them access. They pried open the rusted door. Inside was dust-broken shelving and a few scattered items. Graves stepped over a rotting plank and noticed something wedged behind a panel. It was a weathered shoebox sealed with black electrical tape. Inside were several folded pages of notebook paper and a faded photograph of 3 candy bars laid out in a row. One of the pages was a list of names. At the top was Lucas. Below were Emily and Jamie. Each name had a series of check marks beside it. Graves examined the writing and sent it to the lab for comparison. She believed the handwriting was Hendley's. The list resembled a tracking document, as if he had kept notes on the children. One of the pages contained a sketch of what looked like a basement layout similar to the one in Diane's home. Another showed a crude drawing of a scarecrow with arrows pointing to its arms and face. In the corner of the page, someone had written the word pretend. It was underlined 3 times. Graves felt her stomach tighten. This had never been random. Hendley had planned something possibly for weeks. The scarecrow was not a costume of the moment. It was a symbol, maybe a lure. Returning to the station, Graves contacted a psychologist who specialized in child abduction behavior patterns. She explained the evidence and sought input on what might have driven Hendley. The specialist suggested a power dynamic possibly rooted in unresolved trauma or mental illness. The use of costumes and role-playing, especially around a holiday like Halloween, indicated ritualistic behavior. It was likely Hendley used familiarity and playful imagery to gain the children's trust. The presence of candy costumes in household settings suggested he had wanted to recreate a moment of control over innocence. He did not want to harm them immediately. He wanted them contained, watched, and made part of something that only he understood. Graves sat with that explanation longer than she wanted to. She returned to her board and redrew the timeline. Halperin's statement was added. The storage unit's contents confirmed Hendley had surveilled the children. The basement photo, the napkin with Jamie's name, the trapdoor beneath the farmhouse, all of it pointed to a series of calculated steps. Still, what remained missing was the final piece. What happened after Halloween night? Where were the children taken? If Hendley had staged these scenes, did he do it alone? And if he moved them again, where had he taken them? Graves stared at the photograph of Lucas seated on the wooden floor, his face drawn and silent. The background remained indistinct, but one corner of the image showed something new, a vertical line of dots. She took the photo back to the lab. Digital enhancement revealed a vent grate behind Lucas. The pattern of the grate was old-fashioned with a unique spiral design. The lab technician compared it to registered building materials. It was common in homes built in the 1940s and often found in finished basements. Graves requested a list of properties that matched the construction details and had connections to the Tilley or Hendley family. Only one property fit all criteria. It was a small home in Shelby County once owned by a cousin of Ned Tilley. It had been abandoned since 1999. Graves drove there immediately. The house was barely standing. Weeds had overtaken the front porch. The door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, dust coated every surface and mice darted across the floor. She made her way to the basement. The air was damp and heavy. She found the vent grate on the far wall. It matched perfectly. Beneath it was a patch of floor covered by a sheet of plywood. She pulled it aside and discovered a hatch. This time, it led not to a trapdoor but to a shallow crawl space. Inside were 3 small shoes, each a different size. The soles were marked with the initials L, E, and J. Detective Graves returned from Shelby County with the 3 small shoes carefully sealed in evidence bags. Each one had faded initials on the soles crudely written in permanent marker. The shoes showed signs of long-term storage, but remarkably, they were dry and free of mold. Graves laid them out on her desk, matching each pair to the child by size and initials. Lucas's sneaker was the largest, with a red stripe and a torn lace. Emily's was a pink slip-on scuffed around the toes. Jamie's was a small boot orange and soft-worn smooth on one side. Seeing them lined up together was unsettling. The items were real preserved and intimate. They were not props. They were remnants of 3 lives that had once laughed and argued and walked through the autumn streets of Fairhope. Word of the discovery spread quickly through the department. Graves filed an updated report with state authorities, noting the likelihood that the children had been kept at multiple locations in the months following their disappearance. The evidence now suggested the children were moved from Diane's basement to the Red farmhouse and eventually to the Shelby County house. She requested forensic teams to re-examine all previously closed locations and reached out to Diane again to review any additional places Charles Hendley might have known or had access to in the late 1990s. Diane appeared overwhelmed. She had not spoken of Charles in so long that her memory of his movements had faded into a fog of regret and fear. Later that week, a call came in from a local antique dealer in Fairhope. The man had been sorting through items left in an estate sale when he found a small candy bag tucked inside an old trunk. It was labeled Emily in faded red ink, nearly identical to the first bag found in the attic. The trunk had belonged to a woman named Meredith Fowler, who had passed away 2 months prior. She had been a retired nurse and lived alone for the past 15 years. Her address was just 4 blocks from the Mercer home. Graves drove to the antique shop immediately. The shop owner handed her the bag wrapped in a cloth napkin for protection. Inside were 3 more pieces of candy and a folded paper napkin with a drawing. The drawing was simple, likely made by a child. It showed a house, 3 stick figures, and a tall person with what appeared to be long arms and a wide hat. Graves recognized the crude figure from the other drawing found in the storage unit. It resembled the scarecrow. This drawing, however, had a word scribbled above the figure. It read, "Watcher." Graves looked at the back of the napkin. In faint pencil marks, someone had written the letters N.F. Meredith Fowler's initials matched. Graves added this to the growing list of connections. It was possible that Fowler had known Charles, or perhaps been involved in a different way. She contacted Fowler's surviving relatives and learned that she had once worked in mental health care during the 1980s and 1990s. A search through old employment records revealed that Fowler had briefly worked at a clinic where Charles Hendley had received counseling after his divorce. It was not much, but it placed them in proximity. Perhaps Fowler had known something or been entrusted with the bag. Graves theorized that Charles may have used her home as another hiding place, or she may have helped him unknowingly. The possibility unsettled her. Each new piece pointed to a network of small choices, shared silence, and misread behaviors. Charles had not operated in complete isolation. Someone else had always been near. The candy inside the bag was similar to the previous samples. One wrapper bore a manufacturer date from 1996. Another was a caramel chew, half melted, its paper wrinkled but intact. The third was a peppermint swirl cracked down the middle. Graves sent all items for forensic testing. While waiting for the results, she revisited the attic where the first bag had been found. She walked the perimeter of the space again, this time scanning the beams and boards more closely. In the far corner, she found faint markings scratched into the wood. The symbols were hard to decipher, but one looked like a calendar. 4 tally marks beside it had been crossed through with a 5th. 5 days. Graves noted the detail and compared it to the dates when the Mercer children had vanished. It was possible they had been kept in that attic for 5 nights before being moved again. Graves returned to the Red farmhouse site where the trapdoor had been discovered. Construction equipment had been brought in to stabilize the collapsed cellar. Inside, forensic teams found traces of fabric twine and a rusted lantern. Along one wall, someone had nailed a strip of wood with hooks. One hook still held the edge of what looked like a mask, possibly a Halloween costume accessory. The material was stiff with age, molded into the vague shape of a face. No fingerprints were retrievable, but it added to the disturbing sense of orchestration. Charles had not improvised. He had prepared these settings to create a sense of familiarity or perhaps false safety. Each location felt like a stage. Each object had its purpose. The shoes, the candy, the drawings. Graves thought about what Emily might have felt while holding her candy bag in that attic. Maybe she had drawn the picture to explain what was happening. Maybe the name Watcher was her way of making sense of the figure that followed them. Or maybe it was something Charles called himself. Either way, the repetition of items and symbols was unmistakable. There had been an order to everything, and the candy bags were more than tokens. They were messages, left behind intentionally. Graves had the attic boards removed and taken into evidence. She also requested DNA tests on the second candy bag and the napkin. Results came back within days. Saliva residue was found on the peppermint candy, and the DNA was a partial match to Emily's school toothbrush samples preserved by her mother. It was the first biological evidence linking her to a specific location after the disappearance. Graves called Diane personally to tell her. There was a long pause on the line before Diane asked if it meant her daughter had been alive in that attic. Graves said yes. Diane's voice trembled, but she managed to say thank you before hanging up. Graves added this evidence to her timeline and cross-referenced it with neighborhood activity in 1997. One more name surfaced. A man named Lyle Harmon had been renting the house where the attic was found during that year. He had since moved to Florida, but records showed he was a distant cousin to Charles Hendley. Graves called Florida authorities to assist in locating him. If Harmon had lived above that attic and never reported sounds or disturbances, then he either had something to hide or had chosen not to see. Graves needed to know which. Detective Graves sat quietly in her office reviewing the caseboard again. Each photo note and piece of evidence had been meticulously pinned and connected with colored thread. But there was one connection she still could not fully grasp: the candy. It had appeared in every location. The same 3 brands kept showing up in every recovered bag: Lucas's backpack, Jamie's lunchbox, Emily's attic stash, and now the second candy bag found in the estate trunk. Each piece seemed ordinary at first, but the brands were discontinued or obscure, and they were never found in standard Halloween assortments from 1997. Graves had a theory. Someone had bought those candies on purpose. She began calling every specialty store that had existed within a 100-mile radius in 1997. Most were closed long gone. But after 3 days of dead ends, she reached a small family-run shop in northern Ohio. The owner, Leland Kincaid, still lived above the store. His daughter answered the phone and told Graves that her father might remember if something stood out from that long ago. Graves drove out the next morning. The shop was tucked between 2 abandoned buildings, its sign faded and windows dusty. Inside, she found a cramped space with wooden shelves and antique candy jars. Leland Kincaid sat behind the counter, hunched but alert. He greeted her and listened carefully as she described the brands and wrappers. He rubbed his chin and nodded slowly. He said he remembered those candies well. In October 1997, he had received a large order from a man who insisted on buying only those 3 types. Kincaid said the man had come in late just before closing, wearing gloves despite the mild weather. He remembered the man had a limp and spoke softly as if he was trying not to draw attention. Graves showed him a photo of Charles Hendley. Kincaid stared at it for a long time, then nodded. He was sure that was the same man. Graves asked if Kincaid had saved any sales records. He said they used to keep carbon copies in a ledger. With some effort, he pulled out a box from under the counter. Together, they flipped through the brittle pages until they found the receipt. The handwriting was careful, the date October 30th, 1997. Paid in cash. No name listed. But the order matched the candy wrappers found across every location. Graves took photos of the receipt and thanked him. She stepped outside and stood beneath the weak sunlight. This proved Charles Hendley had gone out of his way to buy candy from a specific store in a different state. He had planned the contents of those bags just as carefully as he had planned the hiding places. They were not random at all. They were part of his control. As Graves drove back to Fairhope, she replayed every moment of the timeline. Hendley had come back into town weeks before Halloween. He had observed the children, spoken to them, perhaps even entered the house when Diane was gone. He had visited locations across state lines, acquired specific items, and built a sequence of staged events. The scarecrow, the candy, the drawings. Each step was a breadcrumb for a trail only he understood. But now, that trail had finally started to make sense. Graves returned to the department and updated her report. She included the candy purchase and added it to the larger psychological profile being constructed by the State Forensic Unit. Hendley was methodical. His actions were not impulsive. He had constructed a world that existed only in his mind, one where the Mercer children became part of a twisted narrative he controlled. Graves visited Diane again to share what she had found. Diane listened in silence as the details unfolded. The candy had always bothered her. She remembered Emily mentioning a piece she did not recognize the day before Halloween. Lucas had said it came from a special bag, not the one Diane packed. She had dismissed it as a school trade, but now the memory sharpened. Diane remembered checking Lucas's backpack that week and finding a crumpled wrapper she did not recognize. It had the same soft corners and faded colors. She had thrown it away without a second thought. Graves asked if anyone else had access to the house that week. Diane looked down and said she'd gone to a grocery store one afternoon and left the back door unlocked. She had not thought anything of it. The kids were at school, but the timing matched. Later that week, lab results returned from the second candy bag. The DNA on the napkin confirmed the presence of both Emily and Jamie. Graves now had biological evidence placing all three children in multiple locations. The Ohio store receipt added a tangible link between Hendley and the preparation. Each item told the same story. The children had been kept alive for a time. They had been moved. They had communicated through drawings, items, and small gestures. They had waited for rescue. And somehow, for 20 years, no one had seen what was right in front of them. Graves re-examined the handwriting found on the napkins and compared them to classroom assignments recovered from storage. Jamie's writing was unmistakable. He had drawn simple symbols likely to express what he could not explain. Emily's writing was more structured. Her last note found in the attic bag read, "I am with Jamie." Lucas's name was not mentioned. Graves wondered if he had been separated from the younger two. If so, where had he gone? She reviewed the Polaroid of Lucas found earlier. His expression was strained, not scared, but focused. He was seated alone. The photo bore no timestamp, but the background included a shadow that curved upward like the edge of a pipe. Graves enhanced the image again. She isolated the pattern of the shadow and overlaid it with photographs from crawl spaces, cellars, and closets. One matched. It came from the Shelby County house. That photo had been taken there. This placed Lucas in the final location, but the others were not present in that photo. Graves theorized he may have been moved first. Perhaps he had been kept isolated. Perhaps he had resisted more. She added this detail to her growing timeline and searched for any nearby locations tied to Hendley that could have housed the other two. One address stood out. It was an old rental cabin listed under the name of a known associate of Hendley. It sat on the outskirts of a wooded trail system 20 miles from Shelby County. The cabin had not been checked previously. It had been overlooked due to a clerical error during the original investigation. Graves coordinated with local authorities and drove to the cabin. The structure was still standing, but barely. Inside, dust covered every surface. Cobwebs stretched across the beams. In a corner of the back room, Graves found a rotted mattress with a tattered blanket. Underneath it was a child's sock. Near the wall, there was a broken plastic comb and a crayon drawing stuck behind a shelf. The drawing showed two children holding hands beneath a crooked sun. Above them were letters that read E plus J. Graves took photos and called the lab to request urgent analysis. She knew in her gut it had come from Emily and Jamie. She stepped outside and stood beneath the trees. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. She could almost hear the voices that had once filled this space. Detective Graves returned to the Fairhope station with the drawing found in the cabin carefully sealed in an evidence envelope. The initials E plus J, written in purple crayon beneath two smiling stick figures, confirmed what she already suspected. Emily and Jamie had been kept there for some period of time. The surrounding details inside the cabin supported the same conclusion. The broken comb, the child-sized sock, the mattress stuffed with old newspaper, and a damp, sagging blanket all pointed to makeshift shelter. Graves reviewed the property owner records again. The cabin had been rented under the name Douglas Marin, a man with no criminal record but a known association with Charles Hendley. Marin had died in 2006 of liver failure. His personal records were sparse, but his rental logs had been stored in a local county office as part of an abandoned estate file. Graves filed a request to examine those documents. At the county records office, a clerk led her to a long-forgotten filing cabinet. Inside, dusty folders were arranged by year and property ID. Graves flipped through until she found the ledger for Marin's cabin. It listed sporadic visits from 1992 through 2000, but one detail stood out. There were 5 entries in the fall of 1997, all marked by the same initials. The handwriting was different from Marin's. Graves leaned closer and read the entries dated October 28th, October 30th, November 1st, November 4th, and November 6th. Each was signed simply with a CH. The notes referenced firewood, delivered meals left, and once a phrase that made her skin crawl. It read, "Too quiet. One stubborn. Will adjust." Graves photographed each page. The handwriting appeared consistent with other samples attributed to Charles Hendley. The dates also aligned with the theory that the children were moved between locations over a short period. She suspected that Lucas had been separated from his siblings soon after Halloween. Perhaps his resistance had made him harder to manage. The ledger supported the timeline that Emily and Jamie had been brought to the cabin after spending several nights in the attic and possibly a brief stop at the Red farmhouse. She contacted the forensic linguist assigned to the case to confirm her assumptions. The linguist reviewed the handwriting and confirmed the entries matched Hendley's known writing patterns. Graves shared the discovery with the task force assigned to the reopened case. A sense of grim determination filled the room. They now had confirmation that the children had been alive and moved in a calculated sequence. The challenge remained in determining how long they survived and when contact with Hendley had ended. The state issued a bulletin requesting any former associates of Marin or Hendley to come forward. Within days, an elderly man from South Bend called to report that he had once helped Marin with cabin repairs in 1998. His name was Joe Pilcher. He remembered seeing a pile of burned paper in the fireplace during one of his visits and a child's drawing on the floor, but Marin had quickly dismissed it as left behind by a guest. Graves drove to meet Pilcher in person. He was cooperative, though frail. He repeated the story and described the drawing. It had shown a stick figure standing beside a tall figure in a hat. The tall figure had long arms and a wide mouth. Pilcher said it had looked more like something from a nightmare than a child's game. He assumed it was a Halloween doodle. Now, knowing what had come to light, he realized it had been something else. Graves thanked him and noted the consistency in descriptions. The tall figure had appeared in multiple drawings now. The scarecrow, the watcher, always looming in the background. At the lab, Graves received results from the items recovered at the cabin. The sock contained trace DNA that matched Jamie's school sweater sample. The crayon also contained residual skin cells that matched Emily's hairbrush. The evidence was irrefutable. The children had been there. The mattress contained fibers consistent with the ones found in the Red farmhouse. It suggested the same bedding had been moved from location to location. A mobile environment, portable elements. Graves believed Hendley had created a cycle of relocation to evade detection. She mapped the distances between each known site and timed the travel based on 1997 road maps. Every move had occurred within a 3-hour window. She revisited the photograph of Lucas again. The enhanced version revealed more than before. In the top corner, there was a scratch on the wall behind him like a mark left by a nail or hook. Graves sent the photo to the architectural team reviewing the Shelby County house. They confirmed the basement had once held a shelf mounted with an iron bracket. The scratch matched the placement and angle. This detail further supported that Lucas had been held alone. The question now loomed heavier than ever. What had happened after November 6th? That was the last entry in the cabin ledger. No more bags had been found. No more drawings. No more sightings. Graves turned her attention to a lead that had been buried for years. A 1998 tip had been called in anonymously from a payphone. The voice said simply, "They went south. They took them to the woods." The call was logged and dismissed at the time due to lack of specifics. But the wording lingered in Graves's mind now. She reviewed maps south of the Shelby County cabin and found a stretch of undeveloped land once used as private hunting grounds. It had since reverted to state ownership. She reached out to local wildlife officials and asked if any man-made structures existed on the property. A retired ranger named Ellis Duran responded with a faded photo. It showed a hunting blind built into the hillside almost invisible from above. He said it had not been used since the early 2000s. Graves visited the site the next morning. The terrain was rough, overgrown, and silent. She and 2 officers made their way through thick brush until they found the blind. It was covered in moss and collapsed in places, but still intact enough to show its purpose. Inside, the air was musty and tight. Graves spotted a tin box wedged beneath a loose floorboard. She pried it open. Inside were 3 photos and a folded envelope. The photos were Polaroids again. One showed Emily sitting by a tree with a plastic toy in her lap. Another showed Jamie asleep curled up on a blanket. The third photo was different. It was a drawing taped to the inside of a cabinet wall. The drawing was smeared but legible. It showed a clock. The hands pointed to 7 and 3. The envelope contained a single piece of paper. It read, "They did not cry the last time." It was written in Hendley's script. Graves stepped back and let the silence settle around her. The woods were quiet, but they no longer felt empty. The weight of years hung in every branch. She collected the items and sealed them in evidence bags. There was no sign of recent activity, no footprints, no clothing, no remains. But the presence of the children was undeniable. They had been here, possibly last, and whoever brought them had known this place well. Detective Graves returned to her office late that evening. The contents of the tin box from the hunting blind were spread across her desk under a white forensic cloth. The 3 photographs were now scanned and enhanced. The clearest of them was the one of Emily by the tree. She was seated with her knees drawn up, her face partially shadowed, her hands gripping a small plastic doll. The toy was pink with a bent arm and one missing eye. Graves noted the detail and checked past property inventories. The doll had once belonged to Emily. It had been listed as missing from her school locker in October 1997. Somehow, it had ended up in the woods, still in her possession. The second photo of Jamie showed him curled under what appeared to be the same blanket recovered from the cabin. That consistency added weight to the theory that the children had been moved with specific items, a method of continuity or psychological tethering used by Hendley. Graves called the lab to verify soil traces on the back of the photographs. If they matched the soil composition from the hunting blind, that would place the children there definitively. While waiting for the analysis, she reviewed past tips again. One name surfaced, previously dismissed because he had moved out of state. His name was Kevin Pryor. He had been a teenager in 1997, living just a mile from the red farmhouse. His statement had been brief. He said he saw a man near the tree line 2 days after Halloween, but the police had never followed up. Graves located Kevin through social media and reached out. He agreed to speak with her via video call the next morning. Kevin appeared on screen with a cautious expression. He now lived in Oregon, worked in landscaping, and had a quiet demeanor. Graves introduced herself and explained the context. She asked if he remembered what he had seen that day. Kevin nodded. He said he had been walking home from a friend's house when he spotted movement in the woods near the old Tilly property. A man was dragging something large behind him covered by a dark tarp. Kevin assumed it was yard waste or hunting gear. What stood out was the man's limp. Kevin had noticed it right away. The man had struggled to keep balance while pulling the tarp. Kevin said the man looked around nervously, then disappeared into the trees. Graves asked if he could describe the man's face. Kevin hesitated, then said he had only seen the profile. The jaw was angular, the hair thin, and the boots heavy. Graves showed him a photo of Charles Hendley. Kevin stared for a long time, then nodded. He said it looked like him, but thinner. He also remembered one more detail. The man had something strapped across his chest. At the time, Kevin thought it was a camera. Graves leaned forward. She asked if he was sure. Kevin said he could not be certain, but it looked like an old video recorder. Graves froze. That detail had never surfaced before. The idea that Hendley might have recorded the children had crossed Graves's mind during earlier stages of the investigation, but no physical evidence had ever supported it. Now, with this account, it was plausible. If a recording device had been used, there was a chance it still existed. She instructed her team to revisit the items found in the Shelby County house and the cabin. Among the discarded electronics recovered from the basement closet in Shelby County was a broken camcorder never cataloged due to its poor condition. It had been placed in a miscellaneous box with other debris. Graves had it pulled from storage and sent to the tech division. The technician spent several hours disassembling the camera and cleaning the components. Eventually, he recovered a small cassette from the internal compartment. The tape was old, partially demagnetized, but still intact. With care, the technician transferred the contents to a secure drive. Graves sat beside him as the footage began to play. The screen flickered. Then an image appeared. It showed a narrow room with wooden walls and a single window. The quality was grainy, but clear enough to make out shapes. A child sat in the corner. It was Lucas. He was looking at the camera, saying nothing, just watching. The tape lasted 10 minutes. It showed Lucas moving around the room, touching the wall, then sitting again. There was no sound. No adult voice. Just the low hum of the recording. Graves felt her chest tighten. This was the first direct visual confirmation that Lucas had been kept alone. She asked the technician to enhance the final frames. As the tape ended, Lucas pointed to the wall. The camera moved slightly as if the person filming had approached him. Then it cut out. Graves ordered the footage duplicated and stored under restricted access. She knew the public would learn of it eventually, but not yet. Not before the full context was understood. Graves contacted Diane Mercer and requested a private meeting. She met her at the family home, the same porch light flickering above the door. Inside, Graves explained what had been found. Diane sat motionless, her hands clenched in her lap. When she saw the image of Lucas on the screen, her lips parted slightly and she whispered his name. Graves assured her that the footage was in safe custody and that the investigation was moving forward. Diane asked if her children had suffered. Graves said she believed they had been frightened and isolated, but strong. She said the drawings showed love and connection between them. Diane wiped her eyes and said she always believed they had stayed together. Graves told her that Emily and Jamie had remained close at least through the last known drawings. Later that evening, the soil results came back from the lab. The sample on the back of Emily's photo matched the soil from the hunting blind. This confirmed that the photos were taken at that site. Graves updated the case file. With the addition of the video footage and Kevin Pryor's eyewitness statement, the sequence of events became clearer. Hendley had moved the children through 3 main locations. He had separated Lucas early, possibly due to defiance or perceived threat. Emily and Jamie had remained together longer. The watcher figured the drawings, the candy bags, all reflected a controlled environment built on symbols. Graves believed Hendley used psychological tools to maintain dominance while creating a false sense of safety. Detective Graves had barely slept in the last 48 hours. The images of Lucas sitting silently in that dim corner replayed in her mind every time she closed her eyes. His expression had not been one of fear, but of something harder to define. It looked like quiet endurance. It looked like a boy who understood more than he should have. The team had now begun combing through every overlooked piece of equipment recovered from the properties tied to Charles Hendley. Boxes of discarded electronics, cassette tapes, even broken hard drives were reevaluated under new light. The focus had shifted. The goal was no longer to find the trail, but to reach its end. That afternoon, Graves received a message from the forensics lab. One of the damaged camcorders contained another cassette. This tape was not in good condition. The audio was distorted, the picture dim, but it played. The footage showed a wooded area with dense brush. The camera angle bobbed slightly as if worn on a chest harness. Leaves rustled. A voice whispered indistinct words. Then a frame froze on a wooden structure with slanted sides. It was not the cabin. It was something new. Graves paused the footage and took a still image. The design was unfamiliar, but it resembled a small root cellar or storm shelter. She contacted the Department of Natural Resources and asked for aerial photographs of the area surrounding the hunting blind taken before 2000. The department provided a grainy image from 1995. In the corner of the photo, covered partially by tree shadow, was a square outline. It had never appeared on updated land surveys because the area had been reforested in 2001. Graves overlaid the map with the recent terrain data. The shape aligned with a section of land about 2 miles south of the hunting blind. It had never been searched. She assembled a team that evening and secured permission from the state to explore the site at first light. The next morning was heavy with fog. The forest floor was soft, the ground absorbing every footstep. They moved in coordinated lines, stepping over fallen limbs and through tangles of vines. Graves's heart pounded steadily as they approached the coordinate. The square shape appeared suddenly between 2 trees half sunken and nearly invisible. A large stone slab covered the entrance. It was stained with moss and split diagonally through the middle. The slab was lifted carefully using portable levers. Beneath it, a wooden trapdoor waited. Graves knelt and placed her hand on it. The wood creaked. It opened. A short ladder led down into darkness. The air inside was stale, unmoved by time. Graves descended first, flashlight in hand. The walls were stone crude and uneven. The floor was dirt pressed down by years. In the corner was a pile of fabric. On the wall opposite the ladder there were faint chalk marks. Graves moved closer. The chalk marks formed small stick figures, 3 in a row. Above them was the word home, written twice. Nearby was a broken chair and what remained of a flashlight. Graves called for the forensic team. The scene was preserved instantly. The lab confirmed that the fabric pile contained a child's blanket and a worn sweatshirt. Fibers matched Jamie's school jacket. The chalk handwriting showed similarities to both Jamie and Emily. The stick figures matched previous styles from their earlier drawings. Soil samples showed biological material still pending identification. Graves stepped outside and stared at the trees. The silence was absolute. If this place had been the final stop, then it had remained untouched for decades. She contacted Diane Mercer personally. The words were difficult to form. She explained that new evidence had emerged, pointing to a likely final location for Jamie and Emily. Diane listened without speaking, then asked if anything had been recovered. Graves said not yet, but the presence of their belongings was undeniable. Later that evening, while reviewing the footage again, Graves noticed something in the corner of one frame. A partial reflection in the lens. It showed a man's face for just a second. Pale. Hollow-eyed. She froze the frame and enhanced it. It was Charles Hendley. His mouth was open as if mid-sentence, but the audio did not carry his words. This was the only footage showing him directly. She sent the image to federal records. They confirmed the match. Hendley had documented every stage of his actions, possibly as a way to relive control, or perhaps to explain it in some internal logic only he understood. Graves returned to the cellar the next morning. The forensic team had begun deeper excavation. Beneath the dirt layer, they discovered a narrow tunnel leading toward a secondary chamber. Inside that chamber were two small beds made from wooden crates and fabric. On one bed lay a folded piece of paper. It had survived due to being wedged inside a plastic sheet. Graves opened it with gloves. The writing was faded but legible. It said, "We stayed here." We waited. Then in smaller letters, "Jamie was sick. I sang to him." Graves placed the note in a sealed case and marked it for immediate preservation. DNA testing confirmed that the handwriting belonged to Emily. The note had been written in early November based on ink composition and paper condition. That narrowed the final timeline even further. It was now clear that the children had been alive in this location for several days, maybe longer. Graves stared at the tunnel wall. A single word had been scratched into the stone repeatedly. It said sky. Graves felt her chest tighten. It was not just a hiding place, it had been a prison, and they had known it. Emily had documented their time with Hope. Her words had outlasted her voice. Detective Graves sat alone in the evidence room, the fluorescent lights humming softly above her. In front of her were two clear storage cases, each marked with a child's name. Inside them were fragments of a story that had taken nearly 20 years to bring into the light. A pink crayon, a piece of chalk, a scrap of blanket, and the handwritten note that read, "Jamie was sick." I sang to him. These objects were small and ordinary to anyone outside the case, but to Graves they held the emotional weight of 1,000 unanswered questions. The children had left behind signs not just of fear, but of resilience, and that knowledge sat heavy on her chest. She opened the case containing the final note and stared at the curved letters. Emily had written with steady hands, likely in the dark, likely after understanding that no one was coming. The note was not just a message to the world, it was a lullaby frozen in time. The final forensic analysis confirmed what Graves had already known in her gut. The biological samples taken from the floor of the storm shelter included mitochondrial DNA consistent with both Emily and Jamie. No remains were found, only residual traces that indicated prolonged presence. No evidence of trauma was uncovered, but the oxygen-deprived environment combined with the cold November air suggested hypothermia as a likely cause. Graves documented the findings carefully. She ensured the report carried no dramatic speculation, only the clear facts supported by evidence. Hendley had kept them moving. He had staged scenes of control, and in the end he had allowed them to disappear beneath layers of earth and time. Lucas's fate remained partially open. No remains had been linked to him, and the final photograph from the Shelby County house was the last confirmed sighting. That uncertainty left a space in the file that Graves did not know how to fill. Graves made one final trip to the Mercer family home. Diane greeted her with a silent nod and led her into the living room where childhood photos still adorned the mantel. Graves sat across from her and explained the last of what had been found. She said the shelter had held only minimal signs, but they were definitive. Diane listened without asking for unnecessary details. When Graves finished, Diane asked if Emily had written the note herself. Graves said yes. Diane closed her eyes and whispered that Emily had always loved writing stories in secret corners. She said her daughter used to hide folded poems under her pillow and write pretend letters to fairies behind the dresser. That memory brought a smile to her face, fragile but real. Diane asked about Jamie. Graves told her the chalk drawings were his. The stick figures had the same style seen in his earlier schoolwork. He had drawn his family holding hands even at the end. Diane asked to see the photos again. Graves pulled them from her folder and placed them on the table. The one of Emily by the tree. The one of Jamie curled under the blanket. The one from the camcorder of Lucas sitting alone. Diane looked at each slowly. She pointed to the photo of Lucas and said he always carried a sense of protection over the younger two. She said he had once run across the street barefoot to stop Jamie from riding his bike into the road. She believed that instinct had not left him. Graves nodded and said she believed Lucas had tried to resist, and that may have been why he was separated. Diane asked if there was still hope he might be alive. Graves paused and said she could not say for certain, but every effort would continue until that answer was known. The next day, the Fairhope Police Department held a press conference. The public had waited years for answers. Graves stood before the crowd with a calm and steady voice. She explained the evidence collected, the sequence of discoveries, and the confirmation of the final shelter site. She emphasized the endurance of the children, their creativity in captivity, and the significance of the notes and drawings. She did not describe the footage in detail, but she acknowledged its importance. She ended with a message to families of missing persons, reminding them that sometimes the smallest clues are left behind and they can carry truth even after decades. When she finished, the room stood in silence. There were no cheers. There were only lowered heads and the sound of restrained breathing. Weeks passed. Graves continued the search for any possible remains of Lucas, scouring every document, recording, and location connected to Hendley. One afternoon, she received a call from a state records clerk who had discovered an unregistered storage unit in a nearby county. The name on the lease was not Hendley's, but the handwriting matched. Inside the unit, among tools and boxes of discarded furniture, was a locked cabinet. When opened, it revealed notebooks. Pages of ramblings, plans, sketches of locations and names written over and over. Lucas's name appeared 17 times in a row. Then a single phrase, written in ink so dark it had bled through the page. He would not be silent. Graves read through the notebooks carefully. The words revealed a fractured mind, obsessed with the control, plagued by symbols and rituals. But nowhere in the pages was there any mention of the final act. The notebooks were sent to the forensic linguist, who concluded they reflected deteriorating mental function, possibly schizophrenia, or a similar condition. The analyst noted a shift in tone in the final entries. One line stood out. It read, "The watcher cannot watch what runs." Graves interpreted this as a possible hint that Lucas had escaped or at least resisted to the end. If he had fled the house, there might still be a chance, however faint. But no official records had shown activity from Lucas since 1997. No sightings had been confirmed. Graves issued a new bulletin with age progression photos and a dedicated hotline. She refused to close the file. Months later, Graves visited the site where the storm shelter had been unearthed. The ground was now resealed and covered with wild grass. She stood alone, listening to the wind move through the trees. She thought about the trail left behind by the Mercer children. It had not been made of breadcrumbs or footprints. It had been made of colors, songs, drawings, and symbols. It had been made of hope, written in chalk and crayon, wrapped in faded wrappers and whispered through the silence of abandoned rooms. They had not vanished. They had spoken. And now the world had finally listened. If you found this story gripping, make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss our next mystery. Let us know in the comments what you think really happened to Lucas and where in the world you are watching from. We read every comment.